But let's not forget that the first miracle Jesus performs, turning water into wine, this whole story from the beginning was already told like 400 years before in the Bacchae, that Dionysus was the wine god. First thing he did was went to the party, ran out of wine, and he turned the water into wine. His mom was a virgin. He was the son of God, which is Zeus. So the whole story is a replica of another story.
Welcome. This is the Dr. Junkie Show, and I'm Ben Boyce. And today's episode features a conversation with the host of the Peace on Drugs podcast that requires a little bit of an introduction. Aaron Akulis and I met last year when I did an episode on his podcast about the book, Dr. Junkie. But we had another conversation last week, also on his podcast, which is linked in the episode description, episode 58, where we planned to talk about how we both stopped using kratom, what tricks we used, and why we decided to stop. But Aaron and I share a common past and a common journey from evangelical religious roots through addiction and on into our struggles with family members for being true to ourselves and for trying to have difficult conversations when their behavior is unacceptable or outright unhealthy, especially when religion is blamed. Before I sat down to record that episode with him, I listened to his previous episodes and got all fired up about his different approach to pushing back when people mix bullshit with truth, or when people allow catchphrases that don't conform to evidence, even though they feel right, slip into otherwise reasonable conversations. And I basically hijacked our talk, which took an unplanned route through the Bible, religious belief, patriotism, and lots of other cool topics. It's worth a listen if you have the time, and it sets the stage for this conversation. But I wasn't prepared for that talk, and you'll hear me apologize today for the many errors I made because the content I was sharing was dusty, like really dusty. For example, I mixed up stories about the Old Testament God commanding the Israelites to commit genocide with a story about the high priest Samuel's sons tricking some of their enemies into getting circumcised so they could sneak in while they were recovering and kill them without resistance. Of course, both stories happened in the Bible, but Samuel's sons weren't acting on God's orders, at least not according to the Bible. I also mixed up a few stories about Jesus' miracles from the New Testament. I bumbled Jesus' story of Lazarus and the rich man, where we get our first real image of hell. The Old Testament didn't have a hell, and Judaism traditionally believes if you die, that's it. We'll revisit a few of these topics here, but on the off chance that you heard that episode and thought, what the hell, dude, that's not right. My bad. Okay, I think that's enough of an intro. Do check out Aaron's work. It's insightful and well-researched, and he's a lot gentler than I am with people who don't agree with him, which kind of makes me realize I should be trying to do the same thing. So with that, welcome, Aaron Akulis. That's a good place to start. Apologies. Now I'm sure you've listened to it. We didn't prepare for an episode that we did on your podcast 2 weeks ago or whatever to talk about what we ended up talking about. And you could tell I've taken like 10 years since I was really deep into this. And I took all of these stories and facts I knew from the Bible, stuck them all in a blender and hit puree. And then I just sort of presented stories that were not wrong, but they were like really wrong. If anybody's a real Bible scholar, I mixed up like the Gentile woman with a bleeding issue who Jesus heals with the Canaanite woman whose demon-possessed daughter. Didn't make a huge difference in a lot of the stories, but just so you know, I did listen through and sort of cringe like, this is bad. So hopefully we can clean some of that up today. Yeah,
I mean, that's what happens when you're just having a conversation, though. And I think the point's still the same, that so there's just some really ridiculous stories in there. But Bible scholars are upset by even saying that. They're not ridiculous if they find a way to look at each story in a way that fits into their own box that makes it make sense to them. I don't know.
It's what we should have been talking about. And as I got to the end of it, I realized you and I are probably both versed in what we actually spent some time talking about, trying to reach out to people that are still where we were at. We understand how they think and encountering walls. And it's almost like we got stuck in the part of the conversation that should be about belief. And hopefully we can talk about that today. It's what we should have been talking about. But when you try to talk to people about this idea of belief, and all you say is something like, If I show up at your house with a little can of what looks like water and say, if you dump this in your gas tank, you'll run for the rest of your car's life on 1 gallon of gas. That's all you'll need. I need $10,000 for this. Do you believe me? No. Why not? And what would it take for you to believe me? Just to establish, what does belief mean? And that's the thing that we should be focusing on, is there's a different word that doesn't exist for what we mean when we talk about religious belief. And when you try to do this with people, what they say is, no, there's not, I believe it. And you get caught in the weeds on, number one, is the book infallible? If Jesus dies at different times in every gospel, and if he comes back at different times in every gospel, and if he's on the planet and sends later at different times in every gospel, we can at least say they contradict each other. They're not infallible on their face. And if we're looking for a moral guide, we can just pick out some of the verses that we again got stuck in the weeds, as we probably do with those folks, talking about all these stories that I then jumbled up and didn't really do us any favors. But at the end of that is, well, of course, no, it's not a good moral book either. You have to do what you just said, which is what everybody does. Jumps around, picks and chooses, ignores some verses. And yet everybody, Freudian projection, I guess, on a mass scale, also begins this conversation by saying, yeah, I understand those other bad Christians over there. They just pick and choose what verses they want. And you and I scratch our heads and say, can we just start there? You clearly pick and choose too. You don't got slaves at home, do you? You decide which ones fit your narrative. And instead of starting with that and just getting it out of the way in 3 minutes, I felt like I hijacked your podcast and we never talked about what we came to talk about.
That's all. It's all good. That's the kind of the whole point of the podcast is I've had podcasts where I'm like, I'm going to have somebody on from the Pineal podcast. It'll be coming out in like 2 weeks. And his podcast is all about psychedelics and, that kind of experience. And we talked about it not once. The whole conversation ended up being about nutrition, veganism, and it's whatever, we're just having conversations. When you're talking about the Bible and whether or not we could say this is true, when you read different chapters and they say different things, but let's not forget that the first miracle Jesus performs, turning water into wine, this whole story of Jesus from the beginning was already told like 400 years before in the Bacchae, that Dionysus was the wine god. First thing he did was went to the party, ran out of wine, and he turned the water into wine. His mom was a virgin. He was the son of God, which is Zeus. So the whole story is a replica of another story. So that by
how does this work? And this is a great piece to add. If you are a non-believer or an atheist or an agnostic or any other religion, or certain people that would still say I'm Christian just because it's default, you just told a story that people can make better sense of the world. But if you are a lot of the folks we know that are sold out, what those folks hear when you and I say those stories. What they hear is, well, of course, the devil has been imitating the truth forever, even sometimes before the Son of God came in the flesh. So, of course, you can find stories that were meant for Jesus that were, remember the staffs that Moses and Aaron went and turned into snakes, and then the Pharaoh's sorcerers did the same. That doesn't prove that the sorcerers were gods just like theirs. Now, when you and I's we're getting caught in the weeds and saying, well, then let's talk about that one now. Why doesn't it prove that? And instead of just saying, clearly, it's a different kind of belief, you and I do this game that it's not a game. It's such good faith. It's what really made that frustration bubble up with me last time, that coincidentally, it's what we were talking about, the bitterness that sticks around when scars aren't resolved and when traumatic events aren't resolved because the people involved are not willing to talk, not willing to budge. You almost keep going back there. And as I was talking about it, I did it on your podcast. I sort of spent the whole conversation talking about, you can't really believe this. Well, of course not. We're talking about a word that's not supposed to exist. And it feels better to say believe. Because if you did make that word up, well, it would just be used for the guy that gets duped, that I show up with my little bottle of water and he pays me 10 grand for it. And now his car's broke. Well, then let's just take for granted, hopefully we both do at this point, the thing you just said to your people in your life about the miracle of Jesus being a repeat of before, which, by the way, says some beautiful things about parts of the Bible that can be taken as moral guidance, a recurring story focused on intoxication in people that weren't fresh to the party, but had already been drinking for multiple days and he wanted to keep the party going. If the creator of the universe is doing that, maybe we need to rethink some policies on drugs if indeed you claim to follow the book. But the problem is that we just skipped over well, then I guess you just believe. And there's some huge problems with establishing a pattern of thought. I call it the religious tent, and we barely got into this. We ran out of time, but a small part of your brain that says, you can't talk to me about whether or not a virgin could ever have a human baby because it's not something I take on evidence. I'm giving you the 10 grand for the thing, and that's the end of it. And how dare you challenge me? And putting that in a small part of your thinking that goes away the second I show up to huckster you from your driveway with a bottle of water. You got to think about my claim differently than claims of divinity and miracles that you can't make sense of in apocalyptic end times. In the tent, as long as it stays within that, we've carved out a spot in our culture where we do our best to respect it. However, that tent, since like the 90s when we were kids, and now we look back and we're like, that tent got mighty big, mighty quick, and it got so separated from what belonged in the tent. It's like dead carcasses of break CDs, right? Whatever BMG executives started tricking evangelical Christians into smashing CDs. Whew, great selling point. It's clear that in hindsight, those were not ordained by God. They were not things that were backed up by the scriptures in the way they were presented. And since they never got cleaned up, the tent's bigger now. And I think this explains a lot of the last 8 years where you and I have been looking at our people and thinking, this guy, I mean, aside from whether he's called by God or not, he's still doing what he's famous for doing. And all that stuff flies in the face of what you taught me was acceptable as a kid. And you taught me to never support somebody like that. Why? We're acting like it's the first kind of belief. It's not the first kind of belief. Yeah. It's that other kind that's definitely not based on facts.
Yeah. And with your analogy about I'm going to sell you this bottle of water that'll make your car run forever for $10,000. What you seem to be happening in the analogy is people are buying the bottle of water, putting it in their car. And when their car runs out of gas, they're telling you they're still driving, and they believe that they're still driving. And the whole time, the rest of their lives, because they don't want to admit that they were duped. They're just going to keep thinking they're driving, and they're not going to go anywhere.
Now, here's where I'm cool, because I love drugs. And of course, there's consequences to lots of different, especially irresponsible drug use. I love driving too fast. I ride mountain bikes and I don't wear a helmet. I should. Love four-wheelers up in the mountains, right? Dangerous things. Even driving's dangerous. But it's a cultural thing. It's a human thing. As long as I'm not hurting somebody else or putting people in undue risk, because some things are just inherently risky, who cares? That's where I'm at. Is like, if all that happens is you're running out of gas and you are wasting your day and maybe years of your life sitting on the side of the road, and everybody that pulls over and says, what's going on? You say, nothing, I'm driving. As long as you're not causing an accident, that's fine. But a lot of folks are sitting in the middle of the road. A good example, I'm going to steal this from Sam Harris. You and I know a lot of people that if a nuclear bomb went off, especially in certain places on the planet tomorrow, they would rejoice. Now, that's not because in their minds they're doing the math of the person in the driveway selling them. They're not monsters. They know, not because of evidence, because it's not provable or unprovable, they just know that in many ways is required. I mean, if it happens in parts of the Middle East, it's a sign of the end times. A lot of religions take verses to mean that until the temple is restored, right? All of these weird things that we grew up with. Rosh Hashanah 88, I've heard you talk about, and we were told, hey, 88's coming and that's the end. And I noticed a lot of those folks kept their retirement funds, but whatever. I was like, here it comes. It came and went. And the guy in the parking lot that just ruined my car showed up when I bought the new car, and he had another bottle of magic potion. And a lot of folks just bought that one too and blew up another car. And it was 2000 with 9/11. And it was Thursday, June 9th, which was an interesting one I grew up with because it got more vague, where now you could sort of just say, oh, well, it didn't come this Thursday, June 9th. In 7 or 8 years, we'll have another Thursday, June 9th. Maybe it was that one. Prepare you either way. It's okay as long as there's not danger or damage to the people around you. But it seems like we've all just lived through 8 years where it's hard to not see people raiding the Capitol. And it's the same thing. When you say, where's the evidence of the people that voted? Because you might be right. It's an incredible claim, but I want to just see what convinced you. They don't really understand what you're saying because they're talking about that second kind of belief. Trump was going to win. He's called by God. So if he didn't, it must be dead people voting. What else could it be? We're not talking about evidence or facts.
No, we're not. And I grew up with a thing on a note on our fridge that said, if we're not here, it's because we've been raptured, and you can still repent. There's still time for you to join us in heaven. Yeah. And I believed when I was a young kid, I believed this could happen. And I always wondered how it would happen. How would I get sucked up into heaven? But it was always this end of the time things. And like you said, there was always a date. my family members always knew the date and they would say it, but then when it wouldn't happen, and the thing is, they still have a date today. But it's like, at what point do you realize that each date's wrong? And then it's like, well, we just got it off a little. This is going to be the date. And I remember for my wedding, one of my aunts asked me, would I like cash for a gift, or would I like a bunch of like rice and beans to put in my, because no, because the end of times are coming, and I'm going to need sustainable food to cook when the whole world economy shuts down, because it might happen. We might not even. She said, you might not even have a wedding because of this is about to happen. And I said, I'll take the cash. And sure enough, she showed up to the wedding, and I got cash and had a good time.
There's the other side of this. This is the retirement counts weren't washed out. The cash did show up. And what do you know? She probably booked her ticket before that morning, because the system that we're all in, where the guy shows up with the bottle and says 10 grand, you kick him off your property. And it's just a non-even event in the day. That separate part is still there, and it's turning out fruit, and it's affecting our lives. And yet, I don't care if you think that there's an end time coming and you will disappear in the rapture. And in fact, it's beautiful and loving that you're taking the time to write notes to people like me that are probably starving, raiding your house, that might not have any freaking idea what just happened. These people disappeared. Their cars crashed. The Left Behind series, the airplanes crashed because the pilots go away. How much love can you show but to say, these people are in big trouble and I'm in paradise, but I still in my heart care about them? The same circuits in our brains are still working. We're just like sometimes drawing things out of that tent. As long as it's not hurting anybody, I still don't care. But when you start actually living like the rapture might be coming, if you did get rid of your retirement account and you got kids, you are back in the lane of traffic where suddenly other people are in danger. If you're spiritually traumatizing or religiously traumatizing your kids and never willing to make amends because it would require you to admit that you either misheard the creator of the universe, or maybe you're on the wrong wavelength and those things you did for all those years weren't quite right. I can also understand it's got to be terrifying. It's probably part of the reason people shore up that religious identity so much, and it gets stickier the longer you go.
Yeah. And how about those people back in, I'm not sure when this was going on exactly, but or I can't remember what it was called either, but when they would leave their inheritance to the Catholic Church because they were offered a better place in heaven if they did that. So they would leave their kids nothing. You were buying something. I can't remember what it was called.
There is a term for it. I like Catholicism to study just because it gives you an idea of where every one of these religions would probably take itself if left to its own devices and then legitimized and given enough time and money and support. But it's the same thing that seems to happen in all religions, only in different, like you and I have talked about being what would in other religions be like completely cut off, even versions of Christianity completely cut off. And evangelicals are big on the word, not just the word, the Bible, but also words and the power of words. There's life and death in the power of tongue, a scripture that gets used all sorts of bananas ways. But there is some truth to that because their discipline is often silence. And they're really good at it. They break CDs. And when you're like, you just destroyed private property that I found enjoyment and fulfillment, and to be honest, escape from some struggles I'm going through because I'm a kid, they don't say, gotcha, or God told me to do it, because that all is like, you're taking a risk that as a human you misheard. They say, here's the language to describe why you were just silenced, why these people were just silenced. And it just feels different. And I think that's a big part of why it's so hard for a lot of people to make amends for it too. That's a sticky way to behave and to raise kids and to travel through the world. You end up treating a lot of people like shit and never noticing it.
Yeah. And for your listeners, like, because we had talked about it on my podcast, but when I was growing up, all my records were taken and broken or thrown away, whatever, because of the lyrics in the records that were bad influence on my brain or whatever they thought. Yeah. So that happened. And my dad's records were actually burned while he was at work. I think that kind of, and he hated that too. He came back and said, oh, all the wives had burned all the husband's records while they were at work. And my dad never forgave my aunt for that one.
Well, you mentioned, though, before that at one point, either you got into your dad's records and broke them yourself, or maybe somebody in your family broke your dad's.
No, yeah, it was my aunt and my mom, and then I had nothing to do with that.
It brought to mind, I did that. I found it was only, we didn't have a lot of secular music around, probably for that reason. But I found a Madonna CD or something and had been well trained at that point, like taught. The thing you do is immediately get the devil out of there, whether you see or hear him or not, because we're not talking about the sort of belief that you double check and look for evidence and question yourself. Take it for granted and never question it, smash. Here's where the power of words came in. When my mom found it, she told me, I mean, this might be the first time I remember my mom telling me, and I knew she meant it because a lot of times she'd say it and didn't mean it. I'm so proud of you. I saw what you did to your dad's CDs, and I'm so proud of you. And that, when you talk about how do you form a kid, right? That, and you don't realize it as a parent most times. A lot of the most formative moments in your life just happen, and you tell your parents later, and they're like, "Nuh-uh, you don't remember that, right?" Because they're not in your head, your body. And if you're operating in this, yeah, sometimes I do drag a corpse into the tent of belief that later on I realize it didn't belong there after all. You're actually doing damage. You're parked in the fast lane sometimes with people behind you that are looking at you like you are infallible. Kids see their parents as right next to God.
Yeah. And one thing I wanted to dial back on when you talked about the Catholic Church and wanting to study them, but the story that didn't get talked about enough, I think, was, do you know how many billions of dollars the Catholic Church had to pay out in settlements for all the kids that had been molested? Then the thing that hasn't been talked about enough is that the U.S. government during the Trump administration bailed out the Catholic Church, gave them like $60 billion. So essentially, we bailed out a bunch of pedophiles. We paid for We paid for all those claims. It just makes zero sense. And I'm not saying Biden would do any different. He is Catholic, but he also.
You want me to make sense for you?
Yeah.
All right. Listen, son. Just to make this ring, it's ringing in my ears. I'm performing my parents. Just because God has a message doesn't mean, no matter how strong the institution that builds around it is, that there won't be people that sneak in there and are given to temptation. And once the devil sets up foundations or he gets roots into a situation, I mean, it's great we went this way in a way, because I just said the devil. And I always think it's one of those weird things that pops up that I'm always like, can you just explain the devil to me? I just want to get this straight. There's a creature who's invisible, who can or can't manipulate the world. And we never really even answer that question, but he can at least maybe read my thoughts and definitely tinker with my thoughts, but not in unlimited ways. And he's infinite, and he can go anywhere, and presumably almost at the speed of light. He's massless. He's not measurable. So clearly he has no mass. And he spends his eternity, because he's so pissed off at somebody, he spends all his time trying to destroy flesh and blood, not because he hates humans, but because he hates the person that created us. Can we just stop on any one of those points? And all right, we lost the signal there for a few minutes, and the server actually dumped around 2 minutes of our conversation. But we had transitioned from talking about the lack of concern for children in many religious organizations to looking at a bigger cultural trend towards lack of caring for children, specifically in the criminal justice system. All right. So hopefully we should still be in there. I forgot where we were at, but it was something about.
I was talking about the kids. You mentioned kids, locking kids up at the age of 15. So we have this thing though, where you have to be 18 to be tried as an adult, but they make all these exceptions for seemingly the minority children. Is what I see the most of. Is that if you're African American, well, 15 is okay to charge as an adult because it's your third offense or whatever for a reason. How are they able to do that?
State laws, and some of these right now are being reshaped. I don't have a whole lot of high hopes that they're not just going to do the same thing they've always done. In Michigan, for example, I have a friend. He was actually my nearest neighbor. We lived in the country as a kid. So growing up, he lived closer to me than anybody else, but it was still 3/4 of a mile away. But he was the only person of color in my school and was treated like total shit, but was also went through some terrible shit earlier in his life that remains invisible. And by the time he moved to the city, he committed this terrible crime and killed a little girl. At 15, sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Because first there's a hearing that is a competency hearing, and then a hearing to decide if there's extenuating circumstances that can let us, the people, instead of saying, what the hell happened that we all fucked up for the last 15 years and let this happen. You could have seen this coming 10 years ago. You could have seen it coming 5 years ago. You could have seen it coming 3 weeks ago, and it was suspended, kick him out of the system, get him the hell out of this house, move him to a different spot, tell him he's bad. And we built this from scratch. And then at 15, of course, we're either going to look in the mirror with just this one case that happens across the country all the time and say, we've been approaching this all wrong, instead of fostering and caring for children and keeping an eye out for how to bring in people that really need that extra help because they were terribly abused as kids and they're internalizing it. We push out and push away and say, you got to act better. It's no wonder. So he's right now on the long line to be resentenced under new laws that say you can't sentence a kid to life without parole. And my suspicion is that he's just going to get sentenced to life with parole. And I totally feel for the victim's family. It was a little girl. I think she was 5 or 6 years old. In no way defend the crime. I just know that nobody does that out of the blue. You are the end product of whatever amount of days you've spent on this planet, and every single thing that happened to you and how your genes made you process it and how your experience made you process it. Give me a kid that's 1 day old, and if you want me to make him beat people up when he's 16 and feel good about it and think he's doing the right thing, I think I could pull that off. I don't want to.
Yeah, the thing is we don't want to, as a society, blame ourselves. So it's easier to just blame the one person, even at the age of 15, whose brain still has 10 years of developing left. I mean, it's really sad the way we treat people. And I've been studying a lot of mental illness right now. I've gotten this podcast, Huberman Lab, and he did a whole bipolar thing.
I told you the other day, like, it seems like we're on this weird similar track. I just stumbled into a few of his podcasts too. Totally recommend. Sorry, I keep interrupting you.
You're good. But yeah, the bipolar one was really amazing. And then he said one of the most common things they misdiagnose as bipolar is borderline disorder. And he went into just a little bit of what borderline is. And then I get a call from one of my family members who's always been problematic and always had fights with political fights and political fights with other family. But he's somebody I love dearly. And he calls me and he's just immediately yelling about some fight he's having with my parents. And when I got the phone, I thought back to that podcast and I was like, I think he's borderline. And I called my mom and I was like, Mom, what was he diagnosed as? She's like, he's diagnosed as borderline. I was like, now all the dots make sense. Yeah. And also I didn't realize how serious borderline was. To me, it sounds like it's a borderline disorder. Like it doesn't sound like something serious. And like, oh, this is as serious as bipolar. And the saddest thing, it's 100% curable if they're willing to do the work, because the only cure is talk therapy. And he's not, because he won't really admit that he thinks it's a conspiracy to control him and make him think he's crazy. But it's really sad. But
and there could be demons out there that are, I mean, I imagine if he's in a certain circle of any religious beliefs, there's also things to map onto that depending on your audience, buy you the ability to not get the help that you need or to not start working on yourself in a way that's not fun. It is really fucking hard at 30, probably 30, when I really started to say, okay, well then let me be honest about what I believe, because it wasn't that I changed my mind about stuff. It was that I changed my mind about believing in belief. I certainly didn't believe all the stuff to begin with because it contradicts itself. And at some point I started to be like, oh, not that either, and check these things off the box that had been vital to my view of the world in religious terms, and realized at some point, like, there's more off the list than there is on the list now. But yet I still feel like I feel guilty if I don't take my kids to church every week or two. I feel like I'm supposed to, in moments of anxiety, I'm supposed to be doing more to bridge this gap between the creator of the universe and I. And yet those things aren't proving positive. They have consistently left me addicted to drugs, and not left me, but that lifestyle all went together. I'm medicated at other places. I think I believe that I'm supposed to believe. And unfortunately, I got kids looking at me, hearing me say I believe, and even all these doubts I'm talking about, they don't see those, because I also believe I'm not supposed to let those out. And I believe if I keep saying it long enough, I mean, my parents seem to not be lying about believing. They must have actually faked it till they made it. So I made it. I just need to keep doing this. I think that all maps onto the conditions that we're seeing actually increase because people were locked in their houses. We're watching networks split and fracture, and you can watch one network talk about how awful it is that the media and the law enforcement is raiding this previous president who's above reproach, and another network show the same footage and tell the exact opposite story, but only the one they want to hear. Unlike what you and I were talking about the other day, we watch Bill Maher, not because he doesn't piss us off, but because he does. He rides that middle line and flicks you in the ear when you're not being a good liberal, but you feel like you are because there's other liberals saying the same thing, and it feels good to join the crowd.
Yeah, I watched him last night, and I was curious what his opinion was about the $300 billion college loan debt. And I like that he didn't just say a great. So a lot of liberals that I'm friends with are just coming out and saying this is amazing, and I'm like, okay, there is some positive here, of course, but I also question what about like they brought up the analogy. What about the working class plumber who doesn't have college but has a truck that he had to buy? You want to give him give him $10,000 to pay off his truck, and also people in working class, on average, make less money than those with a college education. when you but then again though they did stipulate that the bailout is only for people who make less than a certain amount of money with a college degree. So I see the positive, but it's just like it's not just a borderline. Like everybody who's liberal is like, great. It's like, wait a minute, can we?
Not everyone, because I'm with you. I'm like, we are
broke.
When somebody comes, well, yeah, but when a politician comes along, Obama did this with social media, and actually you could follow it back to before our time and notice every successful president or politician has looked at what the person before them did and cranked it up to 50, the most successful news stuff. And Trump took Obama's social media presence and the outrage mostly that was coming back at it and was like, oh, well, it's turned up to a 3 now. Tom from Facebook or from MySpace is gone. We got Twitter and Facebook and all these news networks turned it up to 11 and it fired us up. And as liberals were indignant, this is so immoral. It's one-sided. He's giving tax cuts. We weren't really paying attention to how good the tricks worked. And now we're sort of taking for granted that it's just business as usual now. I wouldn't be surprised if we see like weird hankering with the Supreme Court at some point in the standard that I guess nobody's really set. That it was funny. It was called the Biden rule for the longest time, that you're not supposed to appoint or fill a vacancy on the Supreme Court within the last, I think Mitch McConnell stretched it to like a year of Obama's presidency. And then in the last month of Trump's, or last 2 months, he's like, nope, they shovel through somebody that ends up overturning or being part of overturning Roe versus Wade. Why wouldn't we just do that back? I mean, it was like perfectly choreographed. Mitch McConnell with one president saying absolutely not. In the exact same situation, only way we're saying absolutely. I guess that's fair game now, too. In fact, the election denying worked really well. Maybe the next time we get a big mouth Democrat who starts to fire all those same things that Trump fired in his base, we all get sold out so much that when they tell us there's some hankering with the election going on, we start to crawl into our tents of belief. Liberals suddenly forgot we were supposed to be all worried about disenfranchised folks, people that are living in poverty. The person who has been stuck at a minimum wage job for 30 years because they couldn't get the tools. Maybe they didn't even graduate high school.
Yeah.
So clearly money's fake. I get that. It's like it's all been in somebody's underpants at some point. It's just nasty crinkled paper. We can print it forever. But there is supply and demand. There is how much we trust the government. And that's what money is. And the more we wash this out, and now both sides are doing it, I don't have binoculars that tell us where this goes, but I kind of feel like we're being way too coy and casual with what should have us at least saying thank you, but
Yeah, and I think the college thing it was popular among some of the base. So but again, it's actually fractioned the base a lot, the Democratic base a lot. But
yeah, but he bought 45 million votes. It's not that he bought them, but to be real, how many of those 45 million people aren't going to vote for him if he runs again?
Yeah, what they needed to spend money on is K through 12, because it's not fair when you have areas of the country that are so underfunded that those kids have no chance at going to college, so they won't have no chance of getting any help from something like this.
Sound like a liberal. old school one, yeah.
That's what Bill Maher calls it. I'm old school Democrat. I'm what the Democrat. I believe in what the Democrat Party is supposed to believe. Now the libertarians are about the closest I could vote, but the thing is, I'm not libertarian. I don't believe in privatized prisons. I don't believe in they want to privatize everything. I don't believe in that. I believe in what the Democratic Party is supposed to be standing for, but they're just not there. They've been bought by corporate America.
Yeah, and the back and forth will continue as security and police states ramp up, because now between Salman Rushdie and everything that was going on before with Dave Chappelle, and that's happened, I think, shortly right after we talked, that happened.
Yeah.
I haven't heard much about him, but I assume with the press the way it is, no news is probably good news on the mainstream networks. But I think the only response to that, in the response to people raiding the Capitol or their groups coming out with their AR-15s and then getting in fights, or the shootings that are now increasing because everybody's coming out of their 2 years hiding in their house and our manners are gone and we're popping off at the mouth and shooting each other. There's only one response to that. It's to up the police presence at a time when a bunch of cops and COs have quit, which means new people, and put security on the stage. So up the security and police presence at public events. George Wallace was a Democrat. Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. Political parties like totally switch spots historically every X amount of years. And it seems like the people that live through it never notice it in real time. But then when you look back at somebody saying segregation today, tomorrow, and forever, and getting elected governor, and somebody says, which political party? Today, we know that was definitely Republican. We said, no, it was a Democrat, which means maybe we're living through right now a time when, without realizing it, things that we used to be screaming from the rooftops are getting kicked off of our platform and we're almost not noticing.
It's possible. I see the Democratic Party as moving more Republican, and the Republicans move more further to the right. I just read an article in The Guardian that said that, this election coming up, democracy's on the line, that if the Secretary of States in different states, that like if they all go more Republican, they're going to change the rules. And a lot of it is because these are all election deniers that are running, that have chances of taking over. I've tried to explain this to people. I have people I know that are very Trump supporting conservatives, and I was just like, that's how you overthrow democracy, is by undermining it, saying it doesn't work. And then, so what's the next system? And the reality is I think deep down they don't care if democracy works, because they wanted Trump to be president, and they would be willing to overthrow democracy as long as he could be their president, because they liked what he was doing. And that's the same thing Hitler did, right? I had the guy on my podcast who explained that a lot of the Jewish people, when Hitler took over, they said, this might be all right. He's doing some things for us financially. And then as soon as democracy was gone, he started killing them. And I thought about what could happen in this country that would lead to genocide. I don't think anything. And then Trump said, we should start executing drug dealers. And I was like, aha, there's his road to doing that, because who are the people he's blaming for the drug trafficking and the fentanyl? It is the Mexicans. And you could start rounding them up and saying, you're a part of a cartel, or somebody in the cartel. And that's a terrifying road to see that even as a possibility.
Yeah, and having just mentioned George Wallace, we didn't plan to talk about this either, but that's okay. Having mentioned George Wallace, I also note that we've got this historical legacy of pendulum swinging. We'd like to think, I heard somebody tell me at a staff party, which I seldom go to, but they actually got me out of my house a couple of days ago, say the Congress used to be civilized or something like that. And I was like, I'm pretty sure I've read plenty of stories from 1700s, 1800s, and even in the 1900s where people were like caned, maybe even killed in Congress during a session. Now, I get it. We've lived through this era where it just feels like, well, yeah, we're on the historical arc of the universe, or the moral arc of the universe, and things only get better. I almost wonder if what we're seeing is the silence that was disciplined, because people were like, you can't use those old languages, and you can't be as misogynistic, and you can still do it, because most schools are still segregated. The segregation went away a long time ago. You know what went away a long time ago? Using the language to explain what was going on. We had to all wink, wink, and just say, it's cool if you just don't want to go to school with those other people. Just have your parents do it, and make sure when they move into your city, because wink, wink, the laws say if they live there, they can go to the school. Make sure there's some good reasons for them maybe to not be there if you really want segregated schools. We put it in the hands of the people and said, shut the fuck up about it. And of course, X amount of years go by and all those people get tired of shutting the fuck up about it. And braggadocious McGee comes forward and starts saying X, Y, or Z, gets elected. And lo and behold, on his heels, we notice that the fizzling flames of demagoguery, I'm talking like I'm that smart. I'm not. Those words just fell out of the sky. But they're still in some places locally, and now you have election deniers proudly rising to possibly electoral offices, some already there. I also wonder if that's going to be the nail in the coffin of the big mouse, and we're going to have to go back to the clever folks that could have done everything Trump did and accomplished more if he would have just kept the racism to himself. But it was so powerful to say it out loud. It's the only reason he got elected, is he tied into those people that were just sick of having their woke ass kids tell them to shut the fuck up when they were saying the same things they've been saying for 20 years. And 20 years ago, I was taught to say, I don't even see skin color, because my parents realized, compared to a lot of the stuff people say, that's a good response to plant a flag and let them know I'm not good with the overt racism. I don't even see skin color. I try to treat everyone the same. And lo and behold, 20 years later, I try to have this talk with I keep saying my parents. My dad has actually been unbelievably receptive to this stuff. And once listening to it, you usually realize it's not a moral argument. It's just a conversation where you learn something and go, oh, well, in that case, I may as well not deploy this terminology or use this language. But the other side of my family, staunchly, no, absolutely not. I was good 20 years ago for using this language, and now I've programmed it into my everyday vocabulary for 20 years. I got shit to do today. I'm not trying to rethink how I talk and at some point say it, because of course it'll slip out, and then apologize and then explain to that person why I apologize, because that's effort. We would have to want to build a better society together in that world if we're really going to build it, and always be looking to how do we make it a little better. Nobody gets to think that they get to check out any second and fly to the sky. We would have to actually look at this existence as worth working on, all of us together and listening to each other. And hopefully we're at least moving to where the big mouths go back in the closet, which at least lets the people that are trying to do the work have the conversations without being trolled.
Yeah. That's really what the idea is with my podcast. Again, it started with how do we make this world better? And for me, the drug war at the time was at number one, and it still is one of the most important things to end. But there's so many other things happening now that it's like, I've actually thought about doing a second podcast, the Peace On, Peacing On, and just talk about a lot of other issues. But right now, I think we are in some serious trouble, but we also be asking ourselves, how do we get to a better place? That's it. And then where do we want to be? And then once you look at that, okay, now that we know where we want to be, how do we get there? What steps can we take? But the problem is, it goes back to what we were talking about with religion, that people can get facts, get told extreme logic with why the story isn't true, and they will use their brain to figure out why your logic is wrong. And the same with the drug war. If you say, here's the facts of why the drug war is horrible, it hasn't worked, we spent too much money, people are dying, the other countries are doing it better, you show them all the facts, then they rewire the brain, they figure out what you're saying is wrong and how they need to go more hardcore with the drug war. And it's just people, how can they
move? Yeah. I mean, my God, they cut Uncle Henry out of their lives with tough love 8 years ago. You don't want to say, we killed Uncle Henry. We were culpable because we were told that this is the way you're supposed to treat these people. Get them out or make them change. And if they refuse to change, stop, quote, enabling them. And then he still wouldn't stop drinking. So he, just went down his way, and we haven't seen him in 10 years. You know how much guilt that would suddenly show up if you start to listen to assholes like you and I that are saying, yeah, but a lot of that mentality, which again is no fault of your own, you were programmed like the rest of us, but you learned how to deal with people that you saw as addicted, and you learned to treat them as viral, as contagious, as dangerous, as somebody that you cannot be supporting in any way until they are 100% on the wagon. Even if that means they might have a relapse, it means that they have to feel bad about the relapse, and they should count their days sober, and they should build a life where they just white knuckle through the day. I get it. A lot of people have to do that, but we've done so many disservices to people that didn't need to die or didn't need to be pushed to a spot where awful fucking things happen, from physical and mental damage to trauma experience. Because when the people that trust or that love you the most say, get the hell out, you don't just stop existing. You go find people you can trust a little bit less, who have less interest in mind for you, that would feel a little bit less guilty if they wound up putting you in prison. Your family, they're not going to do that to you. We built the system that way. And we've talked about this with religion. I think it's the same thing. 10 years out, and all the people you've described through that framework, you would have to actually do work to rethink all of them and be prepared for the guilt that is about to show up. Because if it doesn't, something's wrong with you. You have to rethink all that stuff, all the mistakes you've made, all the cop-outs where you just said, I just believe it, that's how it goes. And behind it was something awful that you would have done better to just make amends for.
Yeah, I read something that said if you wanted to create a society that was the most susceptible to overdose and addiction and problems with drugs, the current society that we have is exactly the society you would create. Lock them up, separate them, marginalize them. People will use drugs if they're marginalized. It was, the story of Rat Palace, where there was this old study, that people said, oh, you can see how addictive a drug is by this. They gave rats a choice of cocaine or morphine and water, and they would do the drugs until they died. But that was their only choices. So somebody else said, well, wait a minute. What if we built them a rat palace where they had other rats to play with and mate with? They had toys, and then give them the choice of the cocaine and the water. And none of them, like I think a few of them might.
Well, yeah, you and I would wander over once in a while and be like, and we'd hang out. But then, we'd go back and get some ass, and we'd go run on the wheel for a while, and we'd go ride 4-wheelers around. I mean, we're hoisted on their own petard. This is sort of the irony of the drug war. The frameworks we have, I was taught that, and I imagine you were taught that too. If you use heroin, you'll not only die, but you'll die from addiction. And if you use crack, my God, the first time you use it, you'll be hooked forever. And that framework is the result of those studies. What that study actually says is, like, as long as you put them in a hole and make their family cut them off, right? The star that goes on it, which is like, well, oh crap, I think we're going to have to feel guilty about what we did to Uncle Henry. I hope you don't have Uncle Henry, by the way.
I don't. Yeah, but no, that's exactly right. We've created a system that we've replicated the first rat experiment, and somehow thought that, like you said, the evidence was right there in the first study. That this is what you don't do. Don't isolate the rat. Don't isolate the child. We need to be together. And that's the problem, is people that feel isolated And also, mental illness is real. People, and people don't see it that way. Bipolar, stuff like that. These are illnesses that are extremely detrimental to people's lives. OCD, these different things that people will self-medicate for. And the fact that we treat them as criminals for trying to feel better about things that happen, mania that's destroying their lives or whatever it is, we need to be helping people. And all this money we spent on the drug war, we could have been spending on helping them, but we didn't.
Heroin works really great to treat like anxiety. And for a lot of us, I like story after story of being in rooms with users who we all just did the same amount and we're all daily users and they're assed out. And I'm like, let's go do something. Everyone's wired up different, but those frameworks of what we're talking about, some chemicals are just inherently dangerous. Here's like the full circle to what we were talking about earlier. What the argument is that I'm parked in the middle of the freeway. Like, it's one thing if you just want to pull over to the side and insist that you're okay with these drugs, Ben, but you're parked in the freeway. So people clearly know how to say, we've got to work together to build a better society. And that means you're allowed to have certain beliefs and to do certain things that might hurt yourself or pose a risk to yourself, but you're not allowed to do it in the middle of the freeway because other people are going to get hurt. It's like we've taken that idea, which is very valuable to culture, taken it from where it's most needed right now, and we continue to stick it on people. And with all the people that are employed by the war on drugs, I've been thinking more and more about how undoable a true transformation is, because you would have to just change a lot of the prison structures in the correctional environments into rehab facilities and use the same logic. And what we need to do is do what we were talking about with my 15-year-old friend 20 years ago before the crime, a decade before the crime, and possibly decades before he was born, with the people who were so fucked up and traumatized and ignored that they did what they did to him, which domino rolled down the road, and now it will continue to traumatize into the future. We'd have to say, wait, what is making all these people problematically use drugs? Let's look at that Rat Park experiment. If people are prone to become addicted when they're in these environments, another big one that the studies revealed, it's like we've built it so bad, is that tolerance and sensitization are tied to set and setting. That means that the reason so many people are overdosing is, yes, the drugs have gotten more intense and harder to predict the potency of because of what we're forced to use now between fentanyl and xylazine and all this other stuff. That's the result of the war on drugs. But also because we're using really quick on our break in the bathroom, an unfamiliar space. So when I walk in there, unlike my living room where I use every day and I know the smell, I know the sound of crushing the heroin, the spoon, I see it and I'm like, ooh, my body's already adjusting and saying some heroin's on the way, don't overdose. We really like this stuff, so tolerate it. My tolerance goes up. When I rush out of traffic under a bridge real quick and try to slam dope into my arm real quick, I use as much as possible because, man, I got to get this in and who knows when I'll get my next shot. And my body doesn't start adjusting until it goes, oh shit, there's dope here. And you're more prone to struggle with overdose and other issues like that. The spoon, the environment, the pill bottle, they all fire cues in us that say the medication is coming, start to prepare so you don't have some undue side effects.
So what do you think the answer for that is? So if we decriminalize and allowed for a safe supply to addicts, should it be like a sterile doctor setting to make it kind of boring and not appealing? Or should it be just a fun place that people can go if they need to go and have therapy and whatever they want?
But when it comes to the framework of medicine, I think we're going to run into the same problem. We have this thinking framework that really only lets us think in idea of like what has to be medicine. I like the idea of moving towards a specialty that doesn't exist right now. And it would definitely be related to medicine, but it would be right between the medical department on campus and the social work, counseling, therapeutic, social sciences department on campus, where a lot of what Dr. John Marks did in England, where he was in the medical framework and he was trying to follow the laws. But when they would ask him, so you treat heroin addicted people by giving them heroin? He would say, no, I don't treat addiction because you can't treat addiction. It's just part of being human. So what I do is bring people in who are using problematic, what we would call addicted people, negative life consequences from their drug use. And I make sure, first and foremost, that they really are dead set on using drugs, because I'm not trying to just give a kid heroin that's never tried it and have him feed me a line. And also I bring a counselor and a social worker and possibly their probation officer if they aren't understanding what's going on. And we all sit in a room and we talk So what's going on? You got some medical issues that aren't being treated. Do you need some therapy? Were you traumatized? You got some mental health issues? And we start there. Now, if they want heroin, or he gave them cocaine in cigarette form, which is what finally got him shut down, because people were like, what? That's crack. Yeah, of course. They're going to smoke it either way. But his goal was to say, most of us age out in about 10 years. And you and I are going through this banana shit right now with 40-year-old bodies where we start to be like, I don't want to use unless I'm home. And I don't feel like I have to just stay loaded all day, every day. What the fuck is going on? We're 40 years old. We've got life experience. Our anxiety level is maybe not different, but we've figured out all these tricks to handle it. So that's a long way of saying we'd have to rethink what does a medical frame look like. But yeah, I think it looks like cocaine light. It probably sold over the counter in much like all drugs. You'd prefer to take it orally, or like a guest you had 3 or 4 or 5 weeks ago was talking about chewing coca leaves. Mm-hmm. And if you're to the point of taking straight up 100% powdered cocaine, you'd probably at that point want to go get it from a doctor, but a doctor in the sense that they just know who to refer you to for help, and they'll give you for yourself whatever you want. Because the goal is to get rid of the fucking dealers, not the users. Nobody cares if people are chewing coca leaves as long as they're not supporting violence through people that can't call the cops when their shit gets stole.
Yeah, exactly. I was thinking about of just about how bad the drug propaganda has affected the way we handle things in this country. And with kratom, especially, they keep trying to ban it. Different states are trying to ban it. And they always use this reason. They say, well, we haven't had to test the long-term negative effects of it yet. But why is the only substances that get us high, is that the problem? If it's a new food or a new Dorito chip, or if it's a new cell phone technology, they're not like, well, we better do 30 years of testing before we allow you to use this. Yeah. No, they push all that shit out. But if it's like, oh, this is getting you high, we need to do 30 years of testing because...
They still say that about weed. I swear to God, there's still stories that come out where they're like, well, we don't want to legalize it until Colorado has time to really test it. They say that about heroin clinics. We got to do some pilot studies. And Dr. Marks, who was in the 1980s, was told this. He was asked the same question all the time. Well, this is a pilot study, so how long before you have evidence? And he would also say, it's not a pilot study. We've been doing this forever. And you've talked about, and repeatedly, we talked about briefly, that even in the United States, this isn't how it was. It just like all the other stuff we said today, in our lives, it feels like it always has been this way. If you're alive today and breathing today, chances are it's always been illegal to possess certain chemicals. And because of that, you've always heard this moralistic argument. Of course it's soaked in. Even if you resisted some of it, it's soaked in. Some Yahoo comes along and says, before drugs were illegal, like addiction didn't look anything like this. And the majority of people that would pass as, quote, addicted or struggling with addiction were wealthy, not poor, right? In fact, the vast minority were poor, but heroin was $1 a gram. And it came with the needle that was clean every time. And you could buy it in a way that you weren't like running under the bridge to use. Of course, just like people that drink too much, we have stigma when people are like, well, my Uncle Henry, he's always drunk. Of course, there's still going to be private stigmatization, but that does not do the damage of the cops might arrest me.
Yeah, well, let's just say alcohol would have been the most problematic drug before prohibition, because it still is the most problematic drug. But back in the day, intervention would have looked like the Andy Griffith Show before prohibition. It would have been an absolutely boring watch. Just like everybody having fun.
That's funny. There's an episode where Aunt Bee buys snake oil that's got heroin and booze in it, and she gets all fucked up, and they have to have an intervention for her. I thought you had seen the same episode. I'll send you the YouTube video if you want to watch it.
No, yeah, I do want to see it. Did they? Oh, see, but that show actually did come out after prohibition, so there was probably an anti-drug propaganda episode. Yeah. So I'm wrong. Even in those days, they were propaganda machine was
barely, but yeah. Yeah, that's the trick of it, right? I'm not talking about the Dare stuff, because of course that's bullshit. But Andy Griffith, what other choice did they have? They couldn't have Aunt Bee buy it and be like, damn, I don't know what's in this stuff, but it's pretty good. No, she used it twice. Here's the funny part. The moment of truth is when they come home and him and Barney Fife see her playing the piano and singing. And they can't believe she's so happy and playing with Opie, and like they're just having a blast. That's it. And they're like, oh, this has to stop. I'm like, oh, patriarchy has changed, right? If that's what you would be like, wow, this is unacceptable in the household.
She needs a lobotomy.
Yeah. So again, I'll send you the link. It's great. I'll put it on the episode description if somebody wants to hear it too.
Yeah, I definitely want to see that. That's the Hollywood machine has been I don't know how they got so wrapped up into this. I don't know how that happened, where they were just like, let's go right along with it, because you would think that they might be counter to that idea.
Yeah, but reefer madness. And the government not only isn't going to come after you. So I think about like the flyovers at NASCAR. I know Daytona's on this morning where you're at, which sounds silly that I watch NASCAR, but it's the only place you can watch people push each other around in cars and hit each other going 200 miles an hour. And I'm always like, I want to be in the big wreck where you're spinning through. There's the addicted person in me, right? Spinning through the infield. There's grass flying all over. So you see these flyovers, and at sporting events too, or you see Top Gun is the quintessential example because it just got remade. And we don't really ask ourselves, where do those images come from? But they don't have, especially through the 80s and 90s and 2000s, they didn't have CGI. They couldn't go buy an aircraft carrier and shoot these massive scenes where the ship's cutting through the ocean. The reason the military and army and armed services are so keen to be like, heck yeah, let's do it, is the fucking way it feels to be in that crowd and be like, wow. And if you've been in religious experience where you get the goosebumps because you're in one accord, as the Bible would say, and you're all experiencing something you can't fucking explain, but it is real, and put it in that tent of belief because no one's going to tell me it's not real. It is real, by the way. It's why humans are still around today, probably. But they simulate that. They give us that thing that grows into the fruit of America is the greatest country in the world. And when people like me say, at what? People punch us in the face, right? Or when we don't stand during the anthem because the third verse, it was written by this racist asshole who kept slaves himself and once tried to execute somebody. He was a prosecutor. He suggested execution for somebody for having anti-slavery literature, right? That's the guy we're talking about that wrote that. And then he wrote a verse in there that's like, no refuge will save the hiring or slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave. Really poetic, and it almost slips by, but he's talking about slaves that had the gall to turn on their masters and take up arms because Abraham Lincoln offered them freedom if they joined their side. He said, try it, because you either will run for your life and never come back to this country, or you'll be killed on the way. And we were like, well, yeah, but ignore that.
That line's in the song?
It's the third verse. So that's why we only sing the first one at the event. Now, it's not that I'm like a moral dictator that's like, you shouldn't stand either. I just know that somewhere along the way, somebody chuckled and said, watch this. Let's just keep this as the national anthem. And I'm not down to be that guy that it's the same argument with the statues. It's not history. Nobody goes to learn history from a statue. It's the people we esteem, the people we put before us so that we can look up to them and say, what could I do if I want to someday have a statue too? That's what Francis Scott Key is.
Yeah.
Anyway, the point was the feeling of the Blue Angels. It's money.
I had a feeling, or I didn't have the feeling, but I watched that feeling happen. There's a bar on the beach here that a veteran owns, and it's a very conservative owners and stuff. And so all the people that go there are too. And the musicians always, at one point when the sun's setting, the musician plays "Proud to Be an American" or one of those songs, and this guy marches with the folded flag around and does a salute. And again, he's probably lost people, and he has very, very deep roots in this patriotism. But everybody put their hands over their heart, and then they did Pledge of Allegiance, and people were crying. And then he did this, whole salute thing, and it was, to me, it was just like almost, it was like scary. I was like, if I spoke out again, if I took a knee right now, I'd probably be like, they'd kill me. I mean.
Or you'd have somebody pissed, but do you mean you've never experienced it with patriotism, or do you mean you've never experienced it?
No, I've experienced it with religion, patriotism, and everything before, but it's like, it had been years since I had been in anything like that. And I'm just at the beach having a beer by the water. And then this stuff just happens spontaneous to me because I didn't know it was an everyday thing. I had never been to this bar. I'm like, this is happening right now. Like, what the hell? Like, I'm just at a bar having a beer.
Florida.
Yeah, for real. It's crazy down here with all the flags. There's people dressed up in capes with Trump capes and like walking down the beach, and like I
think that's the same thing. We talked about this the last time we talked. The fear of death seems to be a stand-in for those of us that are like, well, then why are people religious? I mean, it feels right that, well, I guess everybody's afraid of death and they at least have an answer and they never have to die. I think that's part of it, but I think a huge part of it is what we're talking about. It's this feeling that once it shows, I mean, it is real. And I take nothing from anybody that has based their identity on that. You don't have a choice unless you decide one day, should I look a little closer? Should I make sure some of the things in my garden of who I am aren't weeds that are long overdue to be pulled? That is the most difficult, taxing project you will ever take on, and it never fucking ends. And we built a country largely to make sure nobody ever has to do that shit if they don't want to. You can't blame people for being where they're at and not being open to evidence. And yet here we are talking about like, well, then how do we do that thing where we roll the clock back and say before people are programmed up so that you can't blame them for kicking in the Capitol door and thinking they should hang Mike Pence because the president wants them to, how do we inculcate them to test all of their, especially your most valuable, beautiful claims about the existence of the universe? If God is real, he's got some explaining to do on like infallibility, because as much as we feel good when we pray for things that we want or for people to be healed, if he can do anything, that's a bad thing. There's babies flying through windshields as we're talking right now that just the parents forgot to put the seatbelt on. If this is what you think is happening, there's a selective choice going on where somebody's looking down and he's choosing you while ignoring the baby that just flew through a windshield. That sounds like the same sort of narcissistic bullshit that we could all do really well to just say, if the creator of the universe is out there, he's clearly not meddling in human affairs. He might give you peace, but he's not changing the weather because that rain's fucking up someone else's day. Every good thing he's doing for you can't come at someone else's expense without him also being responsible for the expense or for the things that he looks down and says, uh-oh, another baby. Let the semi hit him. That ain't love, and that ain't any sort of all-powerful creator of the universe. There's many reasons I think people grab onto it. I'm an addicted person, so I think a big part is that feeling of the Pledge of Allegiance and the flag.
Yeah, you know what I was thinking about when you talk about the riots was one of my guests, Lawrence Mass, he was talking about, he described a stampede of buffalo. He's like, could you pull one of them out the side and say, hey, just so you know, there's no grass over there where you're running. It doesn't work. He's in a stampede. And that's what happened at the Capitol. So to me, it's like you're going to take up one of the buffalo or one of the people that were in a stampede, and you're going to, so this is groupthink that's happening. And then you're going to put them, you're going to try them as an individual when there was a shepherd that pushed them all in there and he's not getting in any trouble for it. And that's what it doesn't make any sense. He pushed the herd.
One more step though, because I don't think he pushed shit. I mean, the one sort of gold card Trump has is that he knows how to surround himself with people. So he'll have silly ideas and he'll have weird statements that come out that were like, and he just plows through them. But he's never liable, except I think it's like Richard Nixon. The thing you get caught for, you just took boxes and then they gave you every opportunity to give them back. And you were like, I don't even want to look through them. I don't care. I'm the president. Yeah, you're most likely going to get indicted on something that has nothing to do with what we're all pissed off at. But somehow that's how the system works. I see him as he ran for president in 2000. In 2004, he talked about it, but didn't. In 2008, unofficially. In 2012, ran and lost. And in 2016, finally won. He was the same fucking guy every time. And that's why he didn't even make it into the primaries in a lot of those years, is because he was the same guy. Culturally, a bunch of people wanted to kick in the door of the White House. And a bunch of people wanted to know that their guy won and not have some asshole say, show me the evidence or shut up. And nobody was going to make him do that. That's what I think happened. I don't want to take away from his culpability. I mean, he's not the sort of person I want to associate with for all sorts of reasons. I mean, but I also think he gets a lot of credit for things that he just recognized the crowd, kind of like Woodstock 90.
You know, he has some of the best golf records, like according to what the scores that he keeps when he plays his friends, like he's better than the top players in the world he has beat on his course, which means he's just cheating. And
does it? Yes. I mean, this is why he's popular. Does it have to? I mean, maybe he is. I mean, a guy wins at everything. Something in us, this is human too. We just want to be able to say God is going to look down today. And if I pour out my heart to him the right way, I just don't want to feel anxious today, or I don't want to be sick, or I want my husband's cancer healed. And when those things happen, uncritically say, thank you, God, without realizing you're painting yourself as the center of the universe in a pretty obvious way that doesn't make sense if you just look at the people that didn't get their miracle today that are way ahead of you on the list. I think that's the attitude that has slipped out from under the tent. I'm a winner. I'm more than a conqueror. But I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. These verses that they feel really good, and we pulled them out. In my upbringing, instead of having images of homeless shelters and homeless communities that were built, we had images on what Kenneth Copeland had: jets, Bentleys, a big house that we were going to get, a big pool, things that we were believing for. And even then, I remember being like, okay, I guess God wants me to have this stuff. I think some stuff slipped out of the tent a long time ago, and somebody's going to put this together. I don't think I'm smart enough to write the book, but I think our history of religion in belief, not specific religions, but belief, of valuing belief that is immune to criticism, because you're an asshole if you do what I'm doing today, right? You're not supposed to attack people's beliefs. If they say they believe it and it's religious, you let them have it. What happens when that same mentality gets applied to a dude? I think we just saw it.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, he's lying. He's not a good golfer. I agree with you there, but I'm saying I think that's his MO. He wins at everything.
Well, you know what's funny is a lot of his supporters are saying they're planting evidence. But Bill Maher said last night that he wants the documents back. And so if he wants them back, then it obviously wasn't planted. Like, that's the stupidest thing he could say, because his supporters are.
Yeah, but if Jesus died at one time in Matthew and a different time in Mark and a different time in Luke, see how you and I are like, we've taken this step to be like, but it falls apart before you even get to the argument of it's infallible. I mean, mustard seeds aren't the smallest seed. So Jesus is at least misquoted. So the book it's a book. No big deal, right? Big deal. Skip that part. It's in the tent. And that's, I think, the problem is once you click that light on and say that person's in the tent, shit, of course he's the best golfer on the planet. He's God. I mean, he's God's chosen. God chooses winners. God chooses people. And of course he's going to be attacked for his faith.
God chooses winners. Did you ever see the episode, John Oliver with the televangelist? It was a few years ago. He actually
probably, I'm sure.
I think he won an Emmy or something for the episode. But they actually FBI or one form of the government opened up an investigation into evangelical. And it was one of these televangelical. I can't even speak right now.
Televangelists.
Televangelists. They bought a private plane, and they were getting criticism from some people for buying the private plane. So they went and
that was Kenneth Copeland.
They sold the plane and then bought a bigger one. And then they spoke to their congregation. They said that we didn't deserve this plane. So Jesus said, you deserve a bigger plane. And everybody cheered. And it's like, this is your money that you're giving. You're giving
seed, though. Money. I mean, you probably heard all this too. And again, I'm not defending I was an evangelical Christian for 30 years. You don't forget that stuff. And we're not evil or delusional. We just have patchworks that let us hip hop between what we just said and what you're trying to say should be the truth, because we agree with you too. We also want the money to build homeless shelters, and we also want to take care of our fellow men. Family members of both of ours believe that there's enough money to do both. They honestly, I don't know how this math works out, but they think everybody could have an airplane. In fact, that's God's will for everybody. Where do we park them? Who builds the airplanes? Because if I can afford an airplane, I'm not working at an airplane factory. And who's going to fly the airplane? It doesn't matter. It's in the religious tent, but it feels good to know that the King of Kings, with all the storehouses of heaven at his disposal and streets paved with gold, not only wants us to prosper in paradise when we die, but this is how you answer my criticism of like, well, then you're just sort of checking out of the project of betterment on earth. No, we're not. We're trying to do it the right way, which is we plant seed in God's chosen people. God's chosen people show us that seed works because they claim they planted seed too. We didn't really ask them where, but I'm sure they did. And now they have jets and they have a big congregation and God is blessing them. The evidence with huge finger quotes around it, because it's not evidence, but in their minds, that builds the evidence that then says, let the clock roll forward, ignore things that come up. That another good one, the televangelist you're talking about, I space on his name, but he had an earpiece in, and he'd have people fill out cards on the way in and give them to the ushers, and then he would hand pick with an earpiece with his wife in it the ones that had said, my hip's broken, I'm here believing God for a miracle. And if she was crying when she came in and looked like, she would say, pick the woman 5 rows back, her name is Dorothy and she's got a hip issue, and he would heal them. And if you've never seen somebody get healed, people truly believe they get healed. Marjo, the mixture of Mary and Joseph, is another great example that you can watch for free on YouTube from 1978. A kid that was raised by televangelist parents, and there's video of him at like 7. Hallelujah, praise Jesus. And he's got a whole congregation on their feet wearing a tuxedo. And at 25, he decided to give it a shot to fake the whole thing. And he only had one moral crisis at the very end. He was getting ready to go out on stage, having deceived people. I mean, he would go backstage and say, of course, I don't believe any of this stuff anymore, but I want to show you how easy it is to get people to believe that something supernatural is going on and that it doesn't require somebody to channel the Holy Spirit. And he healed people, and he had people slain in the Spirit, and he prophesied over people, and they knew that's true. There's actually Derren, he spells his first name weird. There's a bunch of Netflix documentaries, an illusionist named Derren W, I think is his last name, does this without religion, and he heals people, and they're still healed 10 years later. And he walks through the whole thing, and he repeatedly says, I want to remind everybody, I'm not representing a religion. I'm not claiming to heal you. There is nothing going on tonight. And he brings people on stage who are using walkers, and he straightens them up, and he slays them in the spirit. The draw to religion is a lot more than just fear of death. There's something very real in here that even if it's not in a religious context, it still works.
Do you think, though, like Freud said, though, that at the root, the subconscious fear of death is at the root of religion? That was his theory,
Or of the unknown. I think it's a big part of it, but he wrote this book near the end of his life called Civilization and Its Discontents. He was pissed off. He was tired of tiptoeing around and getting no kudos for trying to be polite and talk through reasonably. And it's this idea that religion is just one of many ways that we ease the pain, not just of death, but of life. Against the dreaded external world, one can only defend oneself by some sort of turning away. And I'm pretty sure that's what the Pink Floyd song Turning Away is written about.
That's really cool. I think for me, like heroin would be a much better turning away than going to church. But that's just me. See, if church works for you, awesome. But why can't heroin work for me? Or heroin's not my thing right now. Like I think I would just keep smoking pot and doing my beer. But I don't know.
Me too for now. Yeah,
that's awesome.
I appreciate you showing up. I wish we would have had more time to talk about your history, but I'll give you a super sweet introduction. I think I'm going to encourage people to actually listen to our episode first, because we just about picked up right where we left off.
That's cool. Yeah, definitely. Good talking to you.
You too.
Later.
That was Aaron Akulis, and you can check out his work on the Peace on Drugs podcast, which I totally recommend. Until next time, you know the line. Love yourselves and the addicted people in your life. I'm Ben Boyce. If you're still here, you might want more. So consider checking out my book, Dr. Junkie, One Man's Story of Addiction and Crime that will challenge everything you know about the war on drugs. You can get it wherever you buy books. If you want to know what the world would look like if drugs were legal, or why we develop tolerance and sensitization to drugs when we take them for extended periods, or if you just want to know why I went to prison, check out the book.